Good people die every day. Good people die regularly for what they believe. The book Fox's Christian Martyrs of the World was written in the 1500s and is an account of Christian martyrs throughout Western history, but focuses on the reign of Queen Mary. It describes the deaths of about 200 good, godly people who died on behalf of their faith, who died as a result for what they believed. Well, pushing that out to today, one source estimates that over 100,000 Christians die each year due to religious persecution. That's nearly 300 people a day, 12 an hour. And that's just from a Christian standpoint. But if we broaden it to include heroes of war, those who have died protecting our country, those who have died on the front line of public services as policemen, fishermen, paramedics, these numbers increase exponentially. Good men and women die regularly. So, what makes the death of Jesus so different? Today is Good Friday, a public holiday. That is at its core is the day that we remember the death of Jesus. But why this death? What is it about Jesus that requires a public holiday in celebration, in notation? Particularly when good men die all the time. What makes his death so different? It's different because Jesus was not just a good man. It's different because Jesus is God. Today, being Good Friday, we are looking at the death of Christ, Jesus on the cross. Now, there are many different ways that we can talk about this universe-altering event, and every Friday as a preacher, I take one aspect of it and try and expound that and apply it to our lives. In the past, I focused on the last words of Jesus, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Last year, we looked at the ugliness of the cross, the pain and torture Jesus would have endured. This morning, what we're going to do is focus on the physical circumstances surrounding the death of Jesus. For God confirms the identity of Jesus by signs in nature, by signs in the temple, by the testimony of the centurion. Each of these events point to who Jesus is and why his death is different. That this was not the death of any good man. Well, the first events we want to look at is the way that creation cries out at the death of Christ. And this happens in two ways. We get this through the darkness coming over the whole land, which is mentioned in Luke. And then in Matthew, it refers to the earthquake that occurred. And in both cases, these are cosmological signs pointing to the significance of the death of Christ. Now, these two events are linked in the Bible to the end times, or more specifically, the day of the Lord. Passages like Amos 8:9, Joel 2:10, and Zephaniah 1:15 point to the judgment imagery of what is known as the day of the Lord. And for the original audience, when these two things happened, that is the link that they would have been making in their head, that these were apocalyptic signs pointing to something big, huge, and massive. It's like many of you will remember in 2009, there was this massive dust storm that hit Sydney. As a result, you walked out your door and everything was in a red or orange hue. At that time, I had to quickly contact my family to make sure that they were still there and hadn't been taken by the rapture, because the sun turning red is an apocalyptic sign and brings us thinking about the end times. Well, these two apocalyptic events would have done the same thing for the original audience in ancient Near East. The Jews would have seen this and thought about God and the day of the Lord. And which is interesting in itself, that at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, in his baptism, you have this big sign of God. The heavens opened, the Spirit descended, and the Father spoke. And now, here at the end of his ministry, at the end of his life, creation itself cries out. Well, let's first look at the darkness. Luke 23:44. It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, for the sun stopped shining. The 6th hour is referring to noon, 12 p.m., the middle of the day. Jesus would have been put on the cross at about 9 a.m. in the morning, remembering that he was arrested in the early morning, having been up all night in the praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now the passage notes that darkness came over the land, and then further explains that the sun stopped shining. The first thing worth noting is that, again, it was midday. It was when the sun was supposed to be at its strongest, and that is when it stopped shining. But then what is this darkness? A natural explanation for the darkness raises the possibility of an eclipse. But a total eclipse is naturally impossible during the full moon, which is when Passover was held. And the Passover meal occurred the night before. That's the Last Supper that we celebrate at communion, before Jesus goes to the garden to pray. So it's not that. Another credible natural explanation is a darkening of the sun's light by a massive sand or dust storm. But no such storm is noted in any of the Gospels. And the specificness of the sun stopped shining kind of pushes beyond that. I actually think what we see here is a supernatural cause. God made it stop shining in whatever way he chose to do that. And he did so to point to the importance of the event taking place, to highlight the nature of the one who was dying. Jesus is not just a good man. There's something else going on here, something else happening. Another way of looking at this darkness is that it is a contrast between the light, the noonday sun, and no light, the sun stopped to shine. And then this links the darkness of his death to the light of the resurrection that will occur 3 days later, or on the 3rd day. Now, the darkness here is mentioned in Luke, but Matthew, on the other hand, doesn't note the darkness, but he does note the earthquake. Matthew 27, verse 51 to 53. At that moment, that is the death of Jesus, the earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Two pretty big things going on here. Matthew notes that at the exact moment of the death of Jesus, when he gave up his spirit, that is when an earthquake happens. That is not just a coincidence. And this, like the darkness, brings to mind echoes of judgment. That God is not happy with what has happened to his son, that God is not happy with what had to happen to his son. The earthquake in itself was not unusual for Jerusalem. Jerusalem is located on the top of a seismic ridge in the Earth's surface, which stretches all the way down to Kenya, and has historically often received earthquakes. The last one occurred in 1927 and was about a 6.3 on the Richter scale, with previous ones being even bigger. And it's worth noting that Muslim shrines on the site in Jerusalem today have been damaged by tremors from time to time. The fact, though, that this earthquake occurs at the exact time of Jesus' death points to something else going on. It is not just coincidence, not just circumstantial. It's pointing to the immense importance to humanity and of the death of Jesus. This is not just the death of a normal man. Matthew describes the result of the earthquake being that the rocks split and tombs broke open. Now, this is suggesting that the earthquake was a pretty decent size, about 5 or 6 on the Richter scale in modern terms. The tombs being referred to were not like graves that are buried underground, but rather they are rock tombs, small caverns where a body was put until it decomposed and the rock was rolled in front of it, as would happen, as did happen with Jesus, and we'll look at that a little bit more at his resurrection. And so when an earthquake happens and the tombs split, well, that's a natural occurrence, a natural result of a large earthquake. That is understandable. What is less understandable, what is less natural, is that people came out of the said tombs. This reference of the saints coming out of the tombs and after Jesus' resurrection appearing to Jesus and appearing to people in Jerusalem is quite debated. Were the saints resurrected at the death of Jesus, or were they resurrected at the resurrection of Jesus? Or did this even physically happen at all? After reading the commentaries on this, I think it's most likely that the saints were resurrected at the resurrection of Jesus. That on the earthquake, the tombs broke open, and then at the resurrection, that is when the saints rose from the death and appeared to many people in Jerusalem. There's a couple of reasons why I believe this. The first is that it doesn't really make sense that the people are resurrected and then just hang around in their tombs. It wouldn't have taken them 2 days to get to Jerusalem. So it's not as if they're just chilling out there and then they appear at the resurrection. No, it's more likely that they were raised at the resurrection. The other reason I would argue that this is the case is because it kind of depends where you put a full stop. But grammatically, it makes sense that the earthquake and the tombs being opened is a separate event to the saints appearing in Jerusalem. But even then, there's still heaps we don't know about this. Like, what kind of bodies did they have? Were they natural, normal bodies, or some kind of supernatural bodies, like that described in 1 Corinthians 15? We don't know what they did after appearing to people. Did they go back to their tombs, or did they rise to heaven? Or did they carry on and live normal lives and die again, like Lazarus? The Bible doesn't say, or give any clarification to any of this. But we do know that the language implies that the saints were well-known Old Testament and intertestamental Jewish spiritual heroes and martyrs. So, what is Matthew doing in referencing this? I think the biggest thing that he is doing in talking about the saints who rose at the resurrection and appeared to people in Jerusalem is that he's linking the death of Christ with the resurrection of Christ. On one hand, Jesus' sacrificial death blots out sin, defeats the power of evil and death, and opens up access to Jesus. On the other hand, Jesus' victorious resurrection promises the resurrection of all those who die in him. They are inextricably linked. And while the cross is our focus today, it is not the whole story. The death has a to be continued on it. There is no full stop, but a comma. The cross cannot be split from the resurrection. Good Friday cannot be split from Easter Sunday. The death to the resurrection. And more of that will be happening on our Easter Sunday through that service. But the resurrection of the saints makes the link for Matthew between Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection. But again, the fact that saints rise at all show that this is not just the death of any good man. So that's the way that creation cries out. But then the second event here is the temple. The next thing that happened at the time of Jesus' death is the temple curtain was torn in two. Luke 22, verse 45b. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Now, as with most things, there's a bit of debate on what this is actually referring to, but it's most likely that the temple curtain being referred to is the one that separates the Holy from Holies from the rest of the holy place of the temple. This curtain was an eloquent symbol of the temple, which basically said in big, bold signs, no access. Access to God, access to the Holy of Holies, which is where God resided, was only allowed by one man, the high priest, and that was only allowed once a year on the Day of Atonement, where he brought in the blood of animals sacrificed for his sins and for the sins of the people. The Holy of Holies was the ultimate no-go zone. It was seen as the resting place of God, and man's access to it was limited to the least. This curtain was an elaborately woven fabric of 72 twisted plaits of 24 threads each. The veil was 60 feet high and 30 feet wide, which is the equivalent of 18 metres, so about the height of our church, and as wide as our church, 9 metres wide, about the length of our church. And it was torn in two. This is not just a little rib, completely torn. And this curtain was thick, and this curtain was heavy, and this curtain was torn like crepe paper from the top down. It wasn't done by man. It wasn't the disciples creeping into the temple to make a symbolic point. No, this curtain being torn was torn by God. And the torn curtain symbolizes something. The fact that it was torn from the top down shows that it was God. And in God doing this, he is ripping down the barrier between God and man. See, before this happened, the way that you had access to God was through the temple. The only way that you could have your sins being forgiven is by going to a priest, and the priest was the middleman. The priest was the guy between you and God. So you would go to the priest, and the priest would go to God, and that is the way it was. Remember, only one person once a year was allowed to gain access to God into the Holy of Holies. But now that the curtain is ripped in two, that is no longer the process. That is no longer what takes place. The temple aristocracy is not the middleman to us and God anymore. Everyone has access to God because of what Jesus did on the cross. We don't have to go through the church. You have access to God right now. This was not the work of God. This was not the work of man, sorry. This is the work of God. And in doing so, he's symbolizing that there is a new era of worshipping God. A new era of worshipping Yahweh is taking place. A new era of gaining access to Yahweh. This is important. This is significant. And it's initiated by the death of Jesus. A death of not just a normal man. This tearing of the curtain actually points to one of the Baptist distinctives of us as a Baptist church, which is the priesthood of all believers. Because of the death and resurrection of Christ, we don't have to go to the temple. We don't have to go to the church. We don't have to go to the priest to access God. You can access him yourself. The curtain, symbolically separating him and us, has been removed. You can pray directly to him. You don't need to go through me as a pastor or reverend. You can confess directly to him. You don't need to come to the physical church body, to the physical church building. You can cry out in anguish and anxiety directly to him. For we now all, because of Jesus Christ, have access to God the Father in a way that was not possible in the Old Covenant. It's interesting that with the curtain being ripped, only a handful of priests would have been aware of that. And they would have wanted to cover it up and make sure that not many other people knew, because it symbolized what they were fearing, that Jesus was not just a normal man. But what had happened was, within a few weeks, several of the priests became believers. We see this in Acts 6 verse 7. And they would have made this fact about the curtain known to the Christian community, that this was not the death of just a good man. Well, this moves us to our last event that we will be looking at, that occurred at the death of Jesus. And that is the testimony of the centurion. The passage in Luke recounts three groups of responses identified as witnesses. We're just going to focus on the centurion for this one. So Luke 23:47. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this is a righteous man." And then we look at the Matthew account, which puts it slightly differently. Matthew 27:54. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." So in Luke, the centurion says, surely it was a righteous man. In Matthew, the centurion says, surely he was the Son of God. But before we get to their response, their testimony, let's look at who the centurion actually would have been. He'd be a Roman soldier in charge of 100 men. And he would have been in charge of Jesus' execution, most likely to have overseen hundreds, if not thousands, of other like crucifixions, having seen much in his service to the Roman Empire. Now, this centurion would not have been a rookie. He was no noob. He would have fought in many battles, seen many things, seen the world, seen horrors never imagined. But at this, the soldiers and centurions, at the death of Jesus, at the darkness, at the earthquake, the centurions felt fear. Hard men, seen war, seen a lot, and now they are scared. That pushes the boundaries of these events. They were significant, they were massive, but even soldiers knew that this was not normal. They'd done this many times before. Crucifixions were their job. It was in their wheelhouse. Many had been hammered to the wood, but none have died like this. This was not normal because this was the death of no normal man. The centurion was affected by this death. He who had seen it all before, something about this death had made an impact on him, had affected him, requiring almost an involuntary exclamation, "Surely this was a righteous man." Now, some commentators in relation to this passage in Luke say that the centurion is saying, well, surely he was innocent. But the word being used is less innocent and more righteous, more pure with God, more completely different than just the word innocence allows. It wasn't just that he didn't deserve to die. It's pointing beyond that to something else going on at the death of Jesus. And then we look at the way that Matthew puts this response, that Jesus was the Son of God. This isn't like a Christian or Jewish reaction to who Jesus is. It's more likely possibly a reference to the Greco-Roman demigod that was believed to be the offspring of one of the pantheon of Roman gods and a human. So it's possible that he was referring to a demigod in Jesus. Another possibility is that this phrase, the Son of God, is like an OMG reference. Like it's a response of fear, like, oh my goodness, I can't imagine this has happened. Or finally, it could have been the confession of faith, getting an insight into Jesus' true identity. We're not fully sure which option that is, but regardless, you get the idea of profound respect. That the centurion himself is recognizing something in Jesus that he had never seen before. He's questioning. His curiosity is being linked, and he's thinking, this is not normal. This man is not just a man, and he is right. He's something other. He is something different. For the death of Jesus was not just the death of a good man. Creation cries out. The temple curtain is torn, and a centurion starts to get some inkling of faith of God, which would have been completely anathema to his position as a Roman citizen, to his role as a Roman centurion. And yet still he's able to exclaim, this was a righteous man, a son of God. The natural laws on that day are null and void. For what happened on that day was not natural. It was supernatural. Creation was affected. The spiritual world would never be the same again. This is an event. This is celebrated. And it's all based on the fact that the death of Jesus is not just the death of an ordinary man. That the death of Jesus is the death, in some sense, in some way, of God. Because Jesus is God. That's why today is important. That's why today is significant. That's why we have a public holiday. That's why many celebrate and recognize Lent and sacrifice something in build up to this day. Because this is not just the death of the good man. This is the death of God. If Jesus is God and Jesus dies, then Good Friday remembers the death of God. I think it is easy for us to downplay the death of Jesus. Well, sure, he died, but he's going to rise again on Sunday, so no biggie. We have a tendency and danger of just skipping forward to the resurrection and not sitting with the heaviness of the cross. Not sitting with the weight of the death of God, what God was willing to do for us. What God was willing to put himself through for us. Even as Christians, we can think of Jesus just as majority man. But he wasn't. He was like nothing that had ever come before or since. He was 100% God and 100% man, meaning that in his death is the death of God. The creation, the temple, the centurion all point to this fact. Why would God die? Why would God put himself through this? It wasn't just a physical death. We've talked about that previously. Something else was going on. Why did he do it? God died on that day for you. God died on that day because he wants a relationship with you. God died on that day so that you could be forgiven. In some sense, in some way, in some understanding, God died on that day so that your sins could be forgiven, so that you could be clean, so that you could enter into a relationship with him. Today we remember the cross. Today we remember the death of God. Today we remember the cost of what God did for us. That has to propel us into a relationship with him. We can't minimize or downplay the sacrifice of what occurred here. It was not just the death of any normal man. And we can't just fast forward to the resurrection, because otherwise we will minimize what happened and what occurred here. Through the death of God, he did this for you. How are you responding to that? Is your life lived in reflection of that? Do you live differently? Is your behaviour, has it seeped into every corner and aspect of your internal and external life? God died so that you could be forgiven. Please sit with that. May that change you. Let's pray. Lord, thank you. We have no other words as we sit with the heaviness of the cross, we sit with what happened on that Friday many thousands of years ago, Lord. Allow it to hit us. Allow it to weigh on us in some way, that you would do this for us. That through the death of Jesus, God in some way died. A cost that we can never understand, a cost that we can never fully contemplate, not in this lifetime. Allow us to sit with that and allow us to propel that into a relationship with you. That we would have a greater understanding of what happened that day. That would lead us to living life differently. Live a life in reflection of the cross. May we see your death differently this year. In your name, amen.